Okay, so while I'm figuring this out, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. The main thing that I want to talk about is, I know you guys have been here for 2 days, and you're probably really tired of, hearing people just talk at you about blockchain, because I know how these sort of things go. So what I wanted to do was, rather than presenting a paper, what I'm doing is presenting a bunch of papers. Thanks. So I took maybe 6 or 7 different papers that we've done on trade and blockchain, and combined them into one giant presentation to kind of give a better idea of what's happening in global trade with blockchain. Okay, so I'll maybe start a little bit about who I am and why I'm here, and the company that I work for and what they do. As you mentioned, thank you very much, I went to MIT. So when I was trying to get here on time, I was just going purely by muscle memory, trying to remember where this building was, hoping I was correct. So I spent a lot of time here. I now work for R3. I'm head of global trade and supply chain. So I'm responsible for all of our different projects that are building on Corda, building blockchain solutions in global trade and supply chain. Before that, I was at Asian Development Bank, where I worked on digitalization of the trade process. So this is everything from like e-seals on trucks to e-commerce websites to digitizing customs. I've come across these problems where I know that digitalization seems like the right solution, but it doesn't actually work in practice. So for example, with our e-seals, we put them on trucks that were going through Nepal, and it didn't occur to us that they actually needed a GPS signal, which they would lose when they went into the mountains, and so therefore, it didn't work. So blockchain is a little bit like that in some ways. People think it's the solution to everything, and it's really not. We've done a couple of different pieces on that, trying to just remind people that when you have a physical problem, blockchain's not going to solve it, right? Blockchain is just about data exchange. And so that's why it's really good for trade, because when you think about trade, you think about an exporter in one country, an importer in another country, maybe they're sending over a container full of pineapples or shoes, and you think about this physical transaction. But as that's happening, there's also a number of different data exchanges that are happening between the different elements. Okay, so R3 is the company that I work for, and they build the blockchain called Corda. So the company itself doesn't have any blockchain applications. We don't build that stuff. We just maintain the platform. And it's a private permissioned blockchain, which I'll talk a little. I don't know what I point at. I'll just kind of point all over the place. Computer, all right, got it. Okay, so there's 2 reasons that blockchain is really useful in trade. And the first is trade volatility. Right? And this is what you see today. So this is actually a look at the UK. So if you look at the red line, this is focused on the case of Brexit, right? So you had Brexit being announced, you had a spike in policy uncertainty, and it didn't really ever go down. So you have this elevated policy uncertainty. And so what happens when you have policy uncertainty? Well, you see businesses making all kinds of suboptimal choices. They're hoarding inventory, wage growth is stagnated, they're not investing. And we don't even know what the outcome's going to be. So that was one problem. And if you think about it closer to home, we have the steel tariffs. And this is kind of interesting because the steel tariffs, I think, were announced in March, maybe. And as of 6 months later, so as of about September, they had received 16,000, the US Department of Commerce had received 16,000 requests for exemptions. So this is businesses that want exemptions from the steel tariffs. Now, there was no way, they absolutely did not expect 16,000 submissions. A submission is like this, right? It's not just a piece of paper, and it's certainly not electronic. So what they were stuck with was reallocating people, hiring consultants, trying to go through this. And when you go through an exemption, it's not just sort of ticking boxes. You're requesting additional information, you're questioning the information, you're getting new documents, and it's a complete mess. But that's kind of how we do things today. When there's an influx of data, particularly in the trade process, we just kind of throw people at it because the process is very manual. And finally, to that point, legacy systems just aren't really designed to deal with the influx of trade and the influx of data that we have today. And there's even more data that we even use, right? So I spend a lot of time talking to, like last week, for example, there was a port that called me and they said, oh, we have so much data. You could probably use that. Like, how do we put this on blockchain? And I was like, okay, well, who uses this data? And they said, well, just us. Okay, well then why would we need it? Like, why would that be used in the trade process? Well, it could. And so that's kind of like what's cool about blockchain is it could be used. And it could actually change the way that we do financing. It could change, the title transfer. We could do smart contracts on it. But today we don't use it. So there's lots of sort of digital islands because the trade process has been digitized, but not in a way that's interoperable. All right. So this is the second problem. This number is global spending by banks on upgrades to legacy infrastructure. So this is just kind of the back office system, right, that they use. And this is spending in 2017. This is very typical, right? So what happens is you just kind of upgrade legacy infrastructure, but you don't actually fix the problem that it was meant to solve. I was having a conversation the other day with actually a friend of mine from MIT who now runs, he's a chief architect at a bank in Europe, and he was saying, yeah, we really need to replace our system. He said, the guy that designed it 30 years ago retired, and every time something goes wrong, we have to go ask him how to fix it, and we have to just shut down the entire thing, and this is not sustainable. But these are the types of systems that we have in banks today. So blockchain is one way that we could make this a little bit more sustainable. Okay, so those being the two problems. Now, haven't we solved this problem before? And this gets to the issue of, is blockchain really different from digitization, right? Because you're just digitizing documents, making them electronic, putting stuff online. Isn't that going to solve most of these problems, right? Like now you can log into online banking. How great. So it's true. Digitalization of the trade process is certainly not new. These are just a few different examples at different parts of the trade life cycle that we've seen that were meant to change everything, right? Some of them are really basic, like AIOCR, which is PDF scanning. But that was for a bank, that's really an innovation. Another one is electronic bills of lading. So bills of lading are a document that's used to transfer it's not only receipt of the goods, it's when you put it on a ship, but also the title to those goods. So it's a legal document. But you can see there's very few FIs as financial institutions that actually use that. BPO was actually meant to be a game changer. BPO is a type of trade instrument that basically takes some of the power away from banks and gives it to corporates. And it was like this wonderful new thing, and it was a complete failure. Like basically no one used it. And the reason is you never had these network effects. But there's something funny about BPO, which is that if you look at the applications built on blockchain in trade finance today, every single one of them has a BPO orchestration. So what that says to me is that BPO itself wasn't a bad innovation. It just was implemented in the wrong way. It was implemented using the wrong technology. So now that we have the right technology, we can actually start to scale it. Anyway, I'll get back to that. And the last one is EUCP, which is a type of standard. And so that's something I'll talk about a little bit later, which is the use of standards in blockchain. Because you really have, if you think about it right now, maybe four different major blockchains that you see in the enterprise space, right? Corda, which is the blockchain that R3 has, Fabric, which is IBM, Ethereum, and Bitcoin. And none of them are interoperable. If you have assets on any one of those, you can't transfer assets between them, which I'll get to in a little bit. But so that's where standards comes in and becomes really important. All right, so this is looking at the trade ecosystem. Like, why doesn't this stuff scale? Well, if you think about the trade ecosystem, it's really decentralized. This is just one example in a trade transaction of all of the different entities and the different networks that they represent. So finance is highlighted because that's kind of where R3 started. We were initially a banking consortium. And what we did was we built applications in blockchain for financial institutions. But when it got to the point where we wanted to deploy them, we realized we were building on Fabric, we were building on Ethereum. We realized that we couldn't deploy them because in a regulated financial institution, you can't use public blockchains. You just can't. They have features, which I'll talk about, that aren't suitable for enterprise. They're suitable for a lot of things, I mean, they're really good for a lot of things, but not for enterprise use. So what we did was, when we realized we couldn't do that, we went and talked to the different banks. And we said, okay, what do you actually need? You want a blockchain solution, you want the features of it, but what do you need it to actually, what are the parameters you need? They gave us a bunch of parameters, and we built Corda. So for us, really starting out in finance, it was great for regulated financial institutions, and since then, we've kind of grown into other sectors. But it was an interesting learning experience. But this slide is also meant to kind of show that we've been building centralized solutions to solve the problem of trade, which is that it's opaque, it's slow, it's costly. And the reason it doesn't work is because it's such a decentralized system. You're never going to have every single one of these entities on one platform. Okay. So this is a look at the problem that we've had with scaling previous digital solutions. So electronic single windows on the left. This is a great screen, by the way. Submission of customs declarations and sea cargo manifests. And basically all I want to show you in this is if you look at customs declarations, right? Partially implemented, most of it's partially or fully implemented by different countries. That's awesome, right? And the reason for that is because it's really easy to force an electronic customs documentation because it's one office. That's it. They say we use electronic documents and then you're done. But with electronic single window, where you can see most countries have not implemented it or are in pilot, the reason is for electronic single window, you need like 10 different government agencies to agree on it. And that's really, really difficult. So this was part of the problem with digitalization that really illustrates some of the problems with blockchain as well. Whoops. There we go. Okay, so this is just kind of looking at what we would need for network effects. It's not just characteristics of the technology, which are important, right? It's also characteristics of the environment. And so this is something that I've seen in trade. This is, I have to say, since I've been working in global trade, this is the first time, and I would say over the past 2 years, that I've seen every single part of the ecosystem looking at the same technology, trying to understand it and trying to implement it. So what that says to me is this is really a time when we can change stuff. Like we can make the things that are wrong with trade, we can try to fix them, we can get closer to solving the problems. So, now these are some of the problems with digitalization that blockchain is going to do a little bit, we think, better than them. And these are scale and inclusion. So first, in terms of scale, these are the numbers you saw in the previous chart. These are the different solutions. No one's really using them. So if you only have a couple of institutions using them, then they're not going to propagate across the system. The second is inclusion, and this is really interesting. I used to do this calculation for the International Chamber of Commerce where we measured the global trade finance gap. And this was specifically aimed at small and medium-sized enterprises, understanding whether or not they were financed or not financed and why not. And so one year, we also had some numbers about the degree of digitalization within banks. So we asked the banks, how digitized is your trade finance process from 0 to 4. And then we measured that against their rejections of SME trade finance applications. And what you can see is really there's no difference. It doesn't matter how highly digitized the bank is. There's no fundamental difference in how much they're financing SMEs. So what that says is digitalization, even though it's going to reduce costs, we're not actually seeing any of those cost reductions or efficiency gains being passed down to why we're doing it, which is SME inclusion.
When you say rejection rate, that's a rejection by bank?
Yeah, so a supplier goes in, asks for a letter of credit, and the bank says no. Okay, so this is the part where I'll get into a little bit more about the blockchain solutions. So I'm assuming you guys have been sitting here for 2 days, so you've probably seen this stuff. Yes, okay, seeing nodding heads. Right, so I'm going to skip most of this. Right, so with blockchain, basically, you make sure that everybody's looking at the same information. So the data is not committed to the blockchain, at least in Corda, because it's a private permission blockchain. It's not committed until the other party has verified it. So right, okay. So this is a look at the different types of blockchains. I'm just going to spend a second on this because I'm not sure what blockchains the other presenters have covered. So what we basically have today, and I'm particularly thinking about trade here, but it is more general, are 3 generations of blockchain. So the first is public blockchain, right? This is Ethereum and Bitcoin. This is what we had at first. They were definitely not designed for trade. Like, that was not the purpose of them. They're open, they're public, and these 3 things at the bottom is what we're trying to balance, right? Within trade, we need those 3 things. But with public blockchains, you don't really have scalability, and you certainly don't have confidentiality. If you're talking about GDPR, you definitely don't have confidentiality. So the second sort of iteration of this was siloed public blockchain. So this is stuff like Quorum, Fabric a little bit, and this solved the scalability problem, and it solved the confidentiality problem and the scalability problem. But what it didn't solve is the interoperability problem. It, in fact, created sort of siloed assets, so you weren't able to interoperate, which you can do with public blockchain, right? They're inherently interoperable. So then the third generation is kind of where Corda sits. And this is a private permission blockchain. So if you build an application on Corda, any applications that are built can interoperate with each other. They can't interoperate with other blockchains yet. I mean, nobody can do that unless you kind of build a bridge, which I can talk about, but I feel like you guys are tired, so I won't do that. But anyway, so these are sort of the, do you have a question?
Sorry to interrupt you, but I don't understand why you call it a blockchain and not just a database.
I can call it a distributed ledger if you like. Let me
It's like 30 years ago with like examples fault tolerance?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so the reason, okay, actually let me tell you a story. So the reason that we call it blockchain, it is, I mean, we used to make a big deal out of calling Corda distributed ledger rather than blockchain. But then it got to the point where, you know how I was telling you that like everybody's talking about blockchain? People were getting really confused when I was like, not blockchain, it's distributed ledger. And they were like, wait, is this something different or is it the same? So basically we just call it all blockchain. That's why. But you're right, I mean, distributed ledger is also correct. Thank you for that question. Okay, so here is where, if I'm giving this talk to bankers, they feel much better about themselves. Because the issue here is really just showing that what blockchain can do is it's not meant to replace these digital solutions that we talked about before. None of these solutions are bad, they just didn't scale. But what blockchain allows them to do is scale. Because you can actually use we finally have the right technology to actually implement these solutions. Okay, so this kind of sales slide, but I thought it was helpful to sort of see this. So if you think about the universe of trade, what do you have, right? You have supply chain management. So this is just stuff that's being built on Corda, which is a very limited part of the population, right? Different supply chains, also different types of trade finance, insurance, identity, other kinds of services. So this is just kind of meant to get a sense of the ecosystem. Okay, so what is changing because of blockchain? Well, there's 2 sort of major things. The first is how businesses collaborate. And so we spent a lot of time building business networks. And like no one knew what a business network was. Because all of a sudden, like with these 2 projects, for example, these are 2 trade finance projects. Marco Polo is an open account solution, which is like supply chain finance kind of stuff. And Voltron is documentary credits, which is like letters of credit. And both of these are done by a consortium of banks, technology companies, and corporates, which is not a way that we've worked in the past before, right? I mean, a bank will come up with an instrument and offer that instrument. Other banks will start to use it. But we haven't worked in this consortium model before, which is really weird. So if you look at logistics, like over the past year, which it's a sector I've started to work in, 5 different initiatives, 5 different logistics consortiums have suddenly come to being. Some of them are competitive, some of them are working on standards, but it's like something that we haven't really seen in the sector before. In fact, I just got invited to a conference on consortiums, and I was like, wow, that sounds so boring, but also very interesting that you're actually having an entire conference around this different way of businesses interacting. So that's kind of cool. The second is really looking at how trade is processed. So this is actually just a bunch of different use cases that are built by ports. And that's weird because ports aren't really like a particularly innovative entity. It's a lot of, kind of warehousing and trucking and logging the goods in and out. But what we see is a number of different use cases in terms of both documentation and also title transfer, which is important. And this actually brings up a really interesting, I hope the next slide is what I think it is. But with the Port of Antwerp, for example, that first example, so what they did was they put phytosanitary certificates on blockchain. And phytosanitary certificate is just food safety, right? I think it was the pilot was a shipment of apples, maybe from New Zealand to Antwerp. And it was done by, the food safety authorities in both countries said, yes, you can do this on blockchain. And it looks great, but if you actually drill down into it, they had to do a shadow transaction. So they actually did the transaction on paper, but then also did it on blockchain. Because it's not actually legal to use an electronic document in phytosanitary certificates in Europe. So this raises, perfect, it is the right slide. So kind of the last thing that I want to focus on, which is what are the challenges to implementation, right? So blockchain can do all these magic things, sort of. But there's three really fundamental problems that we still face that we need to solve before we're going to see widespread adoption. So the first is a legal and regulatory environment. So this is kind of what I was talking about before. This comes out of an extremely dense paper. If there's any lawyers, you should read it. You will really enjoy it. Nobody else will. Looking at electronic negotiable instruments in the US. And so we looked at, okay, because on blockchain, that's exactly what we're doing. And so we said, okay, what is the legal and regulatory environment around it? And so most of it is UCC Article 3. And unfortunately for us, UCC Article 3 defines the instrument itself as being a written undertaking, so it has to be on a piece of paper, and it has to be signed. So it needs a signature. Now, a signature and a written undertaking, a wet signature and a written undertaking, are two things you can't put on blockchain, right? So the only way to implement these types of blockchain solutions today are going to be using a rulebook. And what that does is, using a rulebook limits scale immediately, because all the parties have to sign the rulebook. You can't just use it. So this was actually a really interesting paper, because when we realized this, we went over to the UCC, and we're like, hey guys, your regulations are kind of blocking us. Like, what can you do to help us? And they got a couple of the lawyers involved. They started a task force, and they said, okay, we're looking at this. We're going to see how we can change it. And we thought, wow, that's great. Now, if you ever look at this paper, I think it's footnote 7, because what I wanted to do was, I said, well, how long is this going to take? I want to figure out how long this is going to take. So in that footnote, it goes through UCC Article 5, which does allow electronic letters of credit. And it describes how long that took. It took 8 years for them to change that. And so, great, they're in the process of changing this, so we got 8 years until we can use this solution. Although they promise that they think it will be shorter, maybe 3. But so this is really what we're facing, right? I mean, we can build the technology. The technology's built, it's done, we can use it, but the legal and regulatory environment is not there yet. And the second is standards. And this is kind of what I got to earlier when I was talking about how if you have assets on like Corda, you can't transfer them to Fabric. It just doesn't work. So right now, the way it is, if you remember that sort of square picture I showed you with all the bubbles, as long as you're using an application on Corda, you can interoperate with all the other applications on Corda, but you can't interoperate with applications on, say, Fabric. And so that's kind of typical of trade today, right? So you have all kinds of digital islands with data, it's digitized, it's wonderful, but as soon as you transfer it out, you got to print it, or you have to re-enter it into a different system. So I put up on the right side this thing that we're working on now, which is called the UTN. It's called the Universal Trade Network, which I know sounds a little weird, but what this is doing is it's looking at how do you create standard state objects such that you can, once interoperability becomes a little bit technologically easier, transfer assets between different blockchains. So this is not an R3 initiative, although R3 it started with a bunch of banks, plus R3, plus TradeIX, plus a bunch of industry bodies as well. But basically what we thought is, look, now that all of these different blockchains are building on trade, and we know that we need to have some kind of way to be able to transfer the assets, let's just start now and figure out, okay, what are standard data formats? What are identity frameworks that we can use? Like, who's a trusted notary? What are the communications protocols? So these are kind of the three things that we're looking at, which means that any trade applications that are built on blockchain or off blockchain, doesn't really matter, uses these standards. So like maybe, let's see, one example would be like an invoice or purchase order. So right now, like if you get 100 invoices, they all look completely different, right? The phone numbers are written in different ways, the addresses are written in different ways, first name, last name might be switched. So you can't automatically match them. It becomes very difficult to do that. And the problem with blockchain is you can't have a maybe in a match. The answer is always yes or no. You can't really have that gray area. So you really need standards to be able to do these types of transfers. So this is something that's just been started, maybe over the past year, but that's pretty exciting. That should actually create some of the change that we need. Oh God, and then the worst problem. Okay, so governance. And this is kind of what I got to earlier. Just to give you some insight, like with Corda, so we just released our enterprise version in June, right? So it's not been around forever. And so we're just now, maybe at the end of last year and the first couple of weeks of this year, we've been doing deployment in our first customers. And it's been really, really hard. We've learned a lot because we thought, wow, we got this technology, how great, like just put it on in. Doesn't work that way. And so what we've been doing is kind of learning about, okay, what do you actually need to do in order to make this replicable? So if it's going to take 6 months to deploy it today, we need it to take like 2 weeks to deploy or a day to deploy, once you get the second wave in. So we're working with the first movers now, and it's very difficult. But we're making that process more automatic, more repeatable. So when you do have sort of the second wave, it'll become a lot easier. But it's really, really hard. And governance is one of the hardest parts of this. Because you think about it, a bunch of banks form a consortium that now offers this new instrument on blockchain. Well, okay, how often do you have to update it? Who decides to update it? Do you force all the members to update at the same time? Is there a board? Is there working groups? Like none of this stuff is anything that these groups have done before. And so it's a very slow process, but it's something that we're solving. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I mean, the main takeaways here are that, trade today, even though we think about it as the physical movement of goods, when you think about it from a blockchain perspective, just think about the fact that it's the exchange of data that allows the movement of goods, right? And so that's where blockchain comes in terms of facilitating that data movement, verifying the data, having consensus in a way that it's more efficient, it's more cost efficient. And not only that, but you can kind of create different ways of financing trade, different ways of doing trade. It's not going to make ships go any faster or like the customs official take a shorter lunch break. But what it can do is make sure that you transfer the paperwork more securely. Because like today, if you do a letter of credit, you know what you do? You FedEx that information. So like one of our first pilots was a shipment of soybeans from Argentina to Malaysia. And so what happens in normal circumstances, you ship those soybeans and you put those documents on a plane, which flies over to Malaysia and then delivers them. So that takes 5 to 10 days, right? I mean, in terms of processing all of the information. So with blockchain, it took less than a day. And we've learned things with the pilots over time. But trade today is ready to change. But we have to be really strategic about how we make sure that it does change in a sustainable way. Because one of the dangers here, right, is that blockchain can just have the same problems as digitization, right? You can just end up with digital islands again. Like you have one blockchain, I have a different blockchain, we keep our assets and that's it. But I think what's exciting about this time now is that everybody's so motivated to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's exciting. And there's just a couple of other slides. So this is some of the papers that we've done. Well, no, these are like news things. These are the papers. I made sure it was in like really tiny print so nobody can read it. This doesn't include our newest paper, which is looking at Brexit, which is looking at how how supply chains can use blockchain to reduce trade uncertainty. But all of these are on our website, which I know you will look at. And these are the different things that we do, like with different universities. We have internships. So, part of what we do is we build Corda. We don't, like I said, we don't build the applications, but we do sort of facilitate the building of the applications. Because, since Corda is just a blockchain, not like a company that builds the applications, we have a partner network. So we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that people can build that up. So one thing we have, in case anybody's interested, is pitch competition, which is just kind of looking for different use cases. These are some of the other projects that we've done before with different universities. Because a lot of times, what we're used to designing is not necessarily where the right ideas are. And so we're trying to make sure that we have this additional information out there. So I think that's it. Yes. Thank you guys for listening. I hope that was interesting because I know it was the last talk, right? Oh, you must be so happy. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Alisa. Any questions? Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you didn't say anything about the WTO,
Mm-hmm.
about the international organizations. And you didn't say anything about the governments, other than the governments at a small level,
Yeah.
but not the government saying, oh, this is a way to spur trade and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the problems were smaller business organizations not adjusted. Could you say a word or two about where the governments are?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two things. So with the WTO, they are trying to understand. So they just put out a paper on blockchain, which was, okay. And then what we're trying to do is operate through the e-commerce framework, because really, like in the WTO today, and this is part of the problem where I was talking about the legal issues. The law never anticipated blockchain, right? It didn't even anticipate digital documents. So certainly it did not anticipate blockchain. So if you look at the WTO legal agreements, they also don't really allow for this kind of stuff. But the e-commerce framework includes a lot of things that you would need to facilitate that would help blockchain as well. So that's kind of where that's going. In terms of governments, you do have some governments that are really, really far ahead in this, right? Singapore, Hong Kong. So you do see some first movers, but most governments are kind of, what they're doing is they're allowing like a sandbox. So they'll allow sort of these transactions to go on, and okay, it's not really legal, but go ahead, let's just see if it works. But the process of like changing the legal environment is just really hard, and they're not yet fully committed, except for those couple of governments that I'm talking about, to doing that. A lot of them still, and this is the case in the US for sure, confuse cryptocurrency with blockchain. So like Corda doesn't have a cryptocurrency, for example. Like there's no mining or anything like that, but governments don't necessarily understand that. And so it's a really long conversation. So anyway, the background to this is regulators are doing a lot. We actually used to have I have a slide, I just didn't put it in here, that has the regulators that we're working with, which are global, but they're moving at very different speeds.
I'm from University of Chicago. I personally think about this permission blockchain where they make the relevant parties, not all the public,
Yep.
share the same database. It's a great value to the society. But often the time when I talk to my colleagues like Jacob, he was pushing you on this point where the existing technology has been there for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason that in the old time we didn't push it to the application, or it seems like nobody is working on it. And all of a sudden we have a lot of people trying to work on it.
Yeah.
What has changed, or you think that what's the thing that now is a magical point that you could make it happen?
Well, yeah.
The older technology somehow shining on the new points.
Well, I think, one thing that was interesting to me is when I started doing blockchain stuff, it was probably maybe 2016 when I was training customs officials. And what I would do is I wanted them to be comfortable with the words. So I'd just say, like, do you know what Bitcoin is? And they were like, nope. And I was like, okay, well, let me explain like what blockchain is and how you can use it. And they were kind of like, okay, fine, I don't really understand. And then maybe in the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, you know, when I would give different talks, people would be like, why blockchain? That was like, there was no question I hated more. It was always, why blockchain? Like, why does everybody keep talking about it? But today, that question never comes up anymore. And in fact, it's gone to the other extreme, which I think is your point, which is with people coming and being like, I want to build something on blockchain. I'm like, you don't really need blockchain for that use case. And they're like, but I want it. So I think, you know, we've moved from one extreme to the other where just everybody kind of wants it and they still don't necessarily understand it.
Do governments so impressive on this type of thing? Like regulatory, you mentioned this regulatory issues. I feel like lots of difficulty you were mentioning is on the regulation part.
Right. No, the regulators it depends on the regulator. It really does. There's some regulators, like, so before I moved back to the US, I was in Tokyo. And the Japanese regulator, there was a lot of blockchain startups in Japan. And the reason was because, and so I would ask them, I'm like, what are you doing in Japan? It was like, you know, some Canadian guy. I'm like, go to Canada, like, do your blockchain thing there. And they said, no, but the regulatory environment here is great. Like, if I have a problem, I can just call the government and they'll answer, and they'll help me, like, understand what the parameters are of how I can solve this. I can't do that in, you know, wherever I'm from. So there's definitely different sort of grades of how interactive governments are.
So I've heard one thing about private blockchains is that we haven't really figured out what's the best way of managing governance that can be, you know, flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions. And you said that R3 was working on that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, the governance. Okay. How to make this a short answer. The governance generally, okay, so there's governance at the application level, which is like the letter of credit thing that you're building, and there's also governance at the network level. And so I think what you're seeing in a lot of this space is at the network level trying to make governance such that it's not owned by one particular party, but it's kind of like an open protocol, right? Like W3C or ITF. So that's really where you see a lot of the network governance happening. Governance at the application level is very different. In some cases, you see you see consortiums or entities building particular, like a corporation. Sometimes you see them building a nonprofit. Do they want to commercialize it? Do they not? Do they want to whitelist it? It really, really depends. But basically, like the framework that we use to think about it at R3 is that when you build, there's basically three roles. There's the business network designer, which is generally like the technology company, right? That's built the actual blockchain application. A business network operator and a business network governor. So the operator is like, make sure that everybody does their software updates and stuff like that. Whereas the governor makes policy decisions. So, you know, we're going to move to a different version. We're going to have transactions that are limited at this size, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the framework that we've used to try to help. And this gets back to the question of deployment. We built it, and now you need to like solve all the other problems. So we spent a lot of time, for example, we produced this, we called it, I don't know what it's called now, we called it a business network playbook. So it's basically like the questions you have to ask yourself when you have a solution and you want to commercialize it, to make sure that you're not building something that's going to get like taken over by malicious actors or that's going to violate sanctions. So it's definitely a work in progress, but I can share some of that stuff with you if you're interested.
Any more questions? All right. Thank you very much, Alisa.
You're free. Thank you.